Both sides believe that time is on their side. The Iranians believe that they have a stranglehold on not just the US, but the global economy as well. The likelihood of not just a regional nuclear arms race, but a global nuclear arms race is more in the cards today than it has been at any point in our lifetime.
So, Dr. Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today on the Pakistan Global Alumni Network podcast. 6 weeks ago, no one could have imagined that Islamabad would become the destination where the US and Iran would sit face to face for the first time since 1979. Were you surprised?
Sure was. That wouldn't have been on my bingo card a month and a half ago, that's for sure. Once the conflict erupted, though, it seemed quite likely that either Ankara or Islamabad would be a location where, or perhaps even somewhere in Egypt, would be a location where the two sides would eventually have to come to some kind of indirect type of negotiation, because as soon as the first wave of attacks did not result in any kind of immediate resolution for the American and Israeli side, everyone that I know in the field of intelligence studies felt quite certain that one of these capitals in the region would become sort of the epicenter of negotiation. And of course, the Pakistanis appear to be the first to actually move quite aggressively toward that at the right time. So the timing was quite appropriate and particularly interesting. So for about 21 hours or so, Islamabad became perhaps a moment of a place of a historic negotiation between the two sides, the first ever high-level meeting of American and Iranian officials for over half a century. Quite dramatic.
So, historically, top destinations have remained Geneva, Vienna, or The Hague. And with agreements such as this and mediations of this scale, usually they're being mediated by or brokered by multilateral organizations like the EU that played a major role in the agreement in 2015. How do you see this playing out now from a statecraft perspective? What has Pakistan done so effectively for it to be the sole destination where these peace talks are being held right now?
Right. I think that location says more about what's happening on the US and Israeli side than what is happening on the Iranian side. I mean, quite clearly, there is a bit of a rupture in the relations between the Europeans and the United States, and for Israel as well. I mean, the Europeans are not especially happy with the way that Israel has gone about this particular conflict, as well as the one in Gaza that came a few months earlier. I will say this, that the location also points to the importance of the kind of the global South emerging in this sort of interesting moment where unipolarity is being is fragmenting on the planet. But it also, I think, points to the significance of the Chinese element in these negotiations. I mean, there should be no doubt in anyone's mind that even though the Chinese are not physically present in these negotiations, they're definitely a very major player. Remember that Trump was supposed to have met with the Chinese premier a few weeks ago and had to postpone the meeting. And Islamabad is one of those capitals in the region that has inroads, both within Washington but also with Beijing, and that needs to be remembered in much more than, say, in New Delhi or places like that. That needs to be remembered in these negotiations. I think we're definitely seeing a very active Chinese side, and even though it's not physically present, it's sort of like the elephant in the room that nobody's talking about.
So, as we saw with both sides, be it the Iranian delegation or be it Vice President Vance and the US delegation, both sides really complimented Pakistan and were committed to the fact that Pakistan will be the key mediator between both parties. So, how do you see this playing out now that the first round of talks have happened at Islamabad? Do you feel like both parties will remain committed to Pakistan and remain committed to Islamabad being that destination for the next set of peace talks? Or could these peace talks now be held elsewhere, like Geneva, for example?
Yeah, I would have been surprised had the negotiations determined anything substantial. I think nobody really expected that. So the fact that it didn't is not particularly surprising. I would also be surprised if there were no subsequent rounds of negotiations. I think the more we entering this conflict, the more we realize, I think, that this is going to take a while, that this is not a short-term conflict, that this may take months, potentially even years. It's going to be very difficult to finish this war, to conclude it. A lot more difficult, of course, than starting it. And I think that, once you see the two sides, or in a sense, if you add the Israelis on the American side, the three sides become comfortable with a certain location for negotiations, that kind of physical location, I think you might see that they keep preferring to meet there. We might perhaps potentially in the future see negotiations take place in the Far East, somewhere like, say, Singapore, for instance. But I think for now, everyone's kind of bet is that Islamabad will continue to be the sort of epicenter of these negotiations. And by the way, I'm not so sure that they have stopped completely. I would not be surprised if indirect negotiations continue to be taking place, not necessarily physically in Islamabad, but with the Pakistani mediation that we've seen so far.
The headline said that the talks had failed, that no agreement was reached. But the Pakistani foreign minister said that the talks were very constructive and that Pakistan would continue to play a role of mediator. How true do you think these headlines were, and where do they go from here?
Right. I think both sides believe that time is on their side. The Iranians believe that they have a stranglehold on not just the US, but the global economy as well. And so they're not in a particular hurry to enter or even conclude negotiations. The Americans also believe that the more they keep sort of economically strangling the Iranian government, that at some point the economic pressures will result in its deterioration and potentially even its end. But I would say that you know, I would have been shocked had there been a resolution. I mean, the Iranians, I don't think, particularly the Iranians, came to the negotiations in Islamabad with any kind of particular interest in resolving the conflict. I think for them, the way they see it is that their presence there was essentially a compromise, right? They didn't even have to be there as far as they're concerned. I was actually quite surprised that they went there. I wouldn't have thought that they would have done it. I think the reason why they did it was to sort of just to probe the mind of the adversary, to see exactly what the Americans were about, what they were going to ask, but they were not there for any kind of resolution. On the American side, I think, it's interesting how things have turned out, to say the very least. At this point, I know that Trump keeps harping on about the sort of nuclear issue, but I think the main issue now in the negotiations is not the nuclear issue. The main issue is the Strait of Hormuz. So the war began with a different type of main goal than what has evolved in the last month and a half, which in itself tells you quite a bit about the state of the conflict.
I mean, going into this conflict, Israel and the United States both had their own agendas. But the way that the media is portraying it now, and many people are saying this online as well, the agenda now for the US seems to be opening the Strait of Hormuz, which, of course, before the war started, was already open. With so much money being spent on this war on a daily basis by the United States, and the way energy prices and inflation has soared domestically, how much of an impact will this have on the Trump administration and their vote bank? Are people beginning to become disgruntled?
I think the impact potentially could be incalculable, and I don't just mean in terms of the price of gas or oil or whatever. I think in terms of just in general the price of things, including food, including electronics, including even I've even heard some experts on food security talk about the potential of a global famine, not just in the developing world, but across the world because of the this conflict. Of course, the longer it continues, the more likely this scenario will be. And what's interesting here, and I speak here particularly as an intelligence analyst, it's that clearly, I mean, it just appears so obvious at this point that the US Israeli attack began with one goal in mind and one sort of idea behind this, right? So that Iran was weak, apparently, and the idea was that, you kill the leadership and within, a few days, they're going to fold. And apparently, and that's really, really interesting from an intelligence perspective, nobody seriously thought about, okay, what do you do if that doesn't happen, if they don't fold? What's our plan after that? And there's so many different clues in what has happened along the way that really make the case that this was not seriously considered, including the potentially uncontrollable price of goods, energy, electronics, etc., that we may see resulting from this in about 3 to 4 weeks. If this thing continues for another month, I think we're going to be very nostalgic in the United States for the, $4 to $5 of gas, as the Iranians themselves have pointed out. And I think that the markets themselves are not quite yet pricing the prospective effects of this war in their current calculations, which is in itself quite remarkable.
Dr. Joseph, being an intelligence expert yourself, do you see this as an intelligence failure on both the US and Israel's part, where they failed to actually realize the extent to which Iran would be able to keep this conflict ongoing and be able to actually give them a tough time?
I think, Malik, it's very difficult to point to one particular reason for the current course of events. I think to some degree, intelligence failure has to be part of the image, part of the picture, the general picture. I don't mean necessarily not knowing what was going to happen. I think, based on New York Times reporting, which I think seems quite accurate, when the Israelis approached the United States and said, look, this regime is so ready to fall, to collapse, that it takes just one little push and that will be the end of it. The CIA actually responded to this kind of analysis by saying that it was farcical, and I'm quoting here, the New York Times, which is quoting sources inside the administration. That's a very strong word. Intelligence professionals typically don't use such dramatic language unless very serious things are at stake. So, and it's not like, the CIA and other intelligence agencies had not war gamed this going back, 30 years. I would even go as far as to argue that even though the US doesn't have an embassy in Tehran, it hasn't had one for a long time, Iran has been a perennial intelligence target for US intelligence agencies. Perhaps no other country exists in the world where the US has more intelligence on it except for Russia. And that includes China. I think Iran is a far more perennial target than the Chinese for the US in the last half a century for sure. But it was perhaps more of a failure of intelligence to accentuate and to make clear the potential ramifications of a disastrous miscalculation. So it seems to me that even though the US intelligence agencies, and I don't just mean the CIA, I mean pretty much the entire intelligence community, warned the administration that this was not necessarily the only scenario that we could see out of this attack, they were not forceful enough. They were not determined enough to push back against an administration that has a very, very long record of being dismissive of dialogue in decision making and dismissive, and in some cases, dramatically dismissive of opposite points of view. And I think that, I mean, if you take it collectively, potentially explains why we find ourselves in this current situation.
Okay, so if advice from the intelligence community was also ignored, and many other experts who were advising the administration, their warnings were also ignored, I just want to understand what the public sentiment is right now in the United States. Obviously, you are based in the US, so you would have a better idea of this. Because what we see online, there seems to be frustration building against the US essentially fighting another nation state's war.
Well, I guess it depends who you ask. If you want my personal point of view, I mean, there are several different approaches to this. A lot of people say that we shouldn't have done it and it was a mistake to begin with. My take is that you've broken it, now you own it, and if you leave it half done, you will leave a strategic situation in the region that has ramifications that'll be a lot worse than when before you started. Like you said yourself, the Gulf rather the Strait of Hormuz was open before the war began, and nobody had ever thought that this sort of nightmare kind of nuclear scenario almost would materialize in our lifetime. And yet here we are. There are other people who think we should invade with troops. I think that is sort of like potentially less likely, personally, than using nuclear weapons, right? So I think this is interesting that this is where we are right now. In my opinion, the use of nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons, is more likely than a land invasion by the United States, right? So that again should tell you something about where we are. But in terms of the popular sentiment, and here's what's interesting: America has not yet begun to see the effects of this war in the economic sense. Yes, uh, gas used to be 250 or 280 a gallon, and now it is five, let's say 450 or something like that. But that's because the amount of oil that's being refined that managed to leave the Strait of Hormuz before this was blocked is still trickling in into refineries across the world, and the disruption that we saw a month and a half ago has not yet been felt, and that's because typically, in people in maritime business will know this, that these tankers are so slow in sailing around the world that it takes a month and a half, in some cases 2 months, for them to get to their destination. So it's like you have a hose with water, and at some point you kind of turned off the hose, but the water still keeps flowing through the hose until there's no more. And by most calculations, a couple of weeks from now is when we're going to start seeing that disruption really hit the ground. And I think at that point, popular sentiment is going to really, really change. In some cases, quite drastically. Now, that's what the Iranians are betting on, and that's why for most analysts like myself, we believe that America will return to the negotiation table. I mean, it's pretty obvious to state that if you're winning, you don't negotiate, right? So the fact that there's negotiation going on is that shows that at the very least, the U.S. Israeli side is not winning. Otherwise, you wouldn't be negotiating.
Dr. Joseph, you mentioned the possible use of nuclear arms in this conflict. President Trump had also hinted at this and also tweeted about the end of a civilization. This, of course, was before Pakistan intervened and a ceasefire was agreed upon. But with these threats of nuclear weapons being used in active conflict, do you see this leading to a rise of nuclear proliferation within the region, especially in the Gulf states? Obviously, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have signed a defense pact recently. So maybe Saudi Arabia is not looking to build nuclear arms immediately. But within the region, will this lead to a potential nuclear arms race?
I would say that when it comes to strategic nuclear weapons, I mean nothing is certain. However, I would say the following: I would say that um, the likelihood of a not just a regional nuclear arms race, but a global nuclear arms race is more in the cards today than it has been at any point in our lifetimes. So, in other words, the view that the United States may not be willing, or perhaps even not be able to provide a defense umbrella for its allies, not just in the Middle East, but also in Europe, is something that is being very carefully looked at by capitals all over those regions, right? So I think At the very, very least, the Saudis will probably announce sort of a nuclear umbrella or even a nuclear arsenal in the coming couple of years. Of course, the Iranians should go without saying this is going to be an existential search for them or quest. I mean, the Iranians are looking at how the U.S. is treating, for example, them versus North Korea. And North Korea is also a very belligerent type of state that keeps issuing very dramatic proclamations about leveling the South and striking Washington D.C. with missiles. Their rhetoric is not that different to that of Tehran, and yet in Tehran there's bombs falling, and in North Korea what you see is meetings and quite a bit of respect given by the White House to the North Koreans, and they're looking at the difference and they're wondering what makes the difference. And what makes the difference, of course, is the existence of nuclear weapons. But you're also going to see this in Europe. I'd be so very surprised if the Poles, for example, have not already begun a very active nuclear enrichment program or are looking into the beginnings of that. I would think the Germans as well would follow soon, very soon. And I mean, that's sort of like, in a war like this, you have immediate after effects, things that happen sort of quickly, like, for example, the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz is one of them, the rise in energy prices and what have you. But you have also long-term effects. And these long-term effects are more difficult to predict, but potentially much more serious and more dramatic than the short-term effects that we're seeing around us. And I think that's why your question is so critical.
How do you see the future of multilateral organizations like NATO? The Trump administration has often been critical of NATO, and with the potential nuclear arms race that starts globally, what does the future hold for organizations like NATO?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I will tell you that right now, NATO is probably facing its biggest crisis probably in its entire history. And it started basically with a sort of aggressive approach to NATO by the current administration of the United States. I mean, when you threaten to invade a NATO country because you want to take one of their possessions, and when this country, Denmark, actually sends a special forces team, or in fact, entire teams into that possession, in order to make sure that if the U.S. were to invade, they have a way to defend themselves. I mean, that tells you that things have changed in NATO drastically. Also, when you launch a war like the current one without consulting with your NATO allies and then request that they come and assist you, that typically is not how it works. And again, you see this sort of almost bipolar approach by the White House, where on the one hand it dismisses NATO as unimportant and is insignificant, and then when it needs their assistance, it demands to have it. I mean, clearly that's not how alliances work, and nobody would be surprised if the Europeans decide to either help the United States, but without making it known, because it is very difficult at this point for these countries to convince their own populations that assisting the United States is important, or not assisting at all, as you see in the case of Spain, for example. So I think NATO is facing a massive crisis of confidence. It is something that, Beijing and Moscow have dreamed for years. And right now it's happening. Some would even argue that the current victor of this entire conflict is not the United States or Israel or Iran or any other regional player. It's actually Russia and China. And I think that is not an inaccurate statement.
Most countries would have taken a step back after mediation seemed to have collapsed. But Pakistan has doubled down and has insisted to keep playing this role of mediator. What sort of impact does this have on both Washington and Tehran? Where do things go from here?
Yes, I think your analysis of this, I mean, the question itself is should be part of the analysis. It brings up a number of interesting cues here. The first one is that U.S. policy in the Middle East has always been an effort to prevent the rise of a regional power that is too powerful, as it were. It distinguishes itself too much from its rivals. So keep everything somewhat equal. And in the past, you've had a number of major regional powers. Iran is one of them. Israel is one of them. And of course, let's not forget Saudi Arabia, that's one of them, and Egypt. But now, with the eventual kind of scaling back of Iranian power and Iran's ability to project its power far beyond its immediate region, that opens up potentially a vacuum, right? Because even though, as I mentioned, Iran is definitely not losing this war, its ability to project strategic power beyond the Strait of Hormuz has been limited quite remarkably, and I think that to the very least, Pakistan is sensing this and is perhaps considering the possibility that it might begin to play a more active role in what is one of the most strategically important regions in the world, which of course is the Middle East. In addition to that, if it is true that China is indeed sort of like growing very fast and is able to now begin to challenge American dominance in the Middle East directly at this point, especially after this kind of muddled and inconclusive war in Iran, that's going to have to happen almost certainly if you look at the geography of the area through Pakistan, right? So, in other words, Pakistan can become perhaps a channel through which the American presence in the Middle East and the Chinese sort of incursion into the Middle East will need to be negotiated, as it were. So, I think strategically thinking, this is perhaps not surprising, but definitely a hand well played by Islamabad. It's a bit early to say where this is going to end, but I think for now it's kind of interesting how this is playing out.
So, if the ceasefire holds and this leads to an eventual agreement, do you see Pakistan becoming a much more serious player when it comes to global diplomacy? And do you see Pakistan potentially playing a role in becoming a mediator between other nation states, perhaps other superpowers like both the United States and China?
Yeah, there aren't many countries that can say that have a good relationship with both sides of the spectrum. Also, don't forget that Pakistan is a nuclear power, and it has a very strong reason, actually a multitude of very strong reasons to want to seek stability in the area. I mean, in fact, in some cases, you can even argue that the worst thing that Iran can do to Pakistan is to collapse, right? And that could be potentially a dramatic turn of events where instability in this country of almost 100 million people with a mosaic of ethnic identities and religious affiliations could destabilize not just the Middle East west of Pakistan, but also Central Asia, right? So I think there's no reason for Pakistan to want to see a destabilized Iran, and that's another major justification or perhaps motivation for Islamabad to want to be very central in these negotiations going forward.
So, Dr. Joseph, I want to ask you something as a Pakistani. Oftentimes, our country gets labeled very negatively, is often referred to as a pariah state in many Western capitals. But after what's happened recently in how Pakistan has played such a major role in a ceasefire between two major powers, and Pakistan has potentially stopped the breakout of World War III. What does this mean for Pakistan looking forward? Will this finally change the way people look at Pakistan globally?
Potentially, I mean, you can see how, for example, other players in the broader region have done this in the past. For example, Qatar is a good example of what I'm trying to kind of point to. You know, yes, these are very sort of like sophisticated governments, countries with a long history of both being a belligerent in war and warlike situations, but also negotiators and sort of the Pakistanis understand the sort of the cultural aspect of both South and Central Asia, but also the Middle East. So they're kind of like placed in this sort of very interesting node in that broader region, right? But I think you're right. What they're missing historically is a kind of soft power, this kind of projection of maturity, stability, and perhaps this ability to kind of extend their reach, their political reach beyond their immediate neighborhood, right? Now, could that be an opportunity? Yes. This war is going to alter strategic balances and geopolitical balances in not just in the region but the world for generations to come. Even if it were to end today, it would have ramifications for us that will with us for the rest of our lives. So, a lot of players are positioning themselves to take advantage of this in various ways, right? And it's interesting, right, to see the sort of like dynamic way in which Pakistan has entered this field. Compare that to India, for instance, which hasn't really made many waves. That in itself is quite interesting. Now, there is always the risk, right? The risk being that with particularly on the case in the United States at this point like likes to project itself as a sort of unpredictable player, a disruptor, so to speak, right? So, and it's interesting how one day you can be on the good side of Washington, and on the next day you could be kind of vilified, right? So take the United Kingdom, for instance, or take countries like Ukraine. So there's always there when you play in the kind of chess game with a power that likes to present itself as unpredictable and sort of uncontrollable, things can turn ugly very, very quickly, right? With the Chinese, not so much. With the Iranians, they tend to be a little more kind of predictable and perhaps kind of uniform in their approach. But that risk is always there.
So, last question, Dr. Joseph. You've spent so much of your life studying intelligence and international relations. How do you see what played out this past weekend in Islamabad? What does this mean for the future? Where does the war go from here?
Right. I will tell you, the one thing that really surprised me about the Pakistan negotiations was the fact that the Iranians actually went there. I did not expect that they would. They have no reason to go there, and I think again that was more of like a scouting mission, a reconnaissance mission on their end to kind of see what the Americans are thinking, to talk to them directly and assess their psychology, but also to appear as not kind of like a belligerent sort of like stubborn force, but to kind of show goodwill not to the Americans because they don't care about that relationship anymore, but to the rest of the world, including to the Pakistanis themselves. As far as where the world goes from here, this is not the only time, or in fact, the only time in my lifetime, where we've seen the United States enter into a major miscalculation, strategic miscalculation, and large powers like the United States are not sort of there. This is doesn't It's not a rare occurrence. Like look at what happened to the Russians in the case of Ukraine. In my lifetime alone, we've seen major strategic miscalculations. Let me just remind you what happened in Iraq just a few years ago. The difference is, right? So even though Iraq itself was a massive blunder, in my opinion, strategically speaking, President Bush had the courage, in a way, within about a year and a half, 2 years, to recognize that he had fallen into a major strategic blunder and then try to fix it. How? Essentially by hiring the people that were criticizing him before to help him get out of that mess. That's when, for example, General David Petraeus was hired to basically see what he could fix in what was left of peace and security in Iraq. But that in itself was an interesting approach by a president. Presidents are not known to admit to errors, and I think that's was basically an admittal of error. My question is, right, what's happened has happened. Trump has potentially a couple of months to try to fix this, but will he be able to admit error and then try to bring to the table other voices in Washington and beyond that are willing to help him get out of the mess that he created with the help of the Israelis. My sense is that he's not able to do that. Like culturally, he's just unable to get there. And that's why I think that the effects of this war have just begun. We're going to see a lot more serious effects socially, economically, and politically. Maybe I'm wrong. There's a small chance that I'm wrong, I think. And if happens to be the case, I'll be the happiest person alive if that were to happen.
Dr. Joseph, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.